If you have any questions during the presentation, please click on the Q&A icon on your screen. We'll try to answer your questions during the presentation, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for more. A recording of this webinar will be available tomorrow. Thanks for your attention. I'm now going to close the poll. And it looks like from the results, we have some folks who are compliant with GDPR and CCPA. That's great. And we have a good mix of B2B and B2C. Thank you so much. All right. Now for a few words from our legal department. As a reminder, we are not attorneys. Anything you hear today should not be considered legal advice. Instead, you should consult your own attorney. All right, with that over, let me introduce today's presenters, Tom Sychek and Eric Vargas. Tom Sychek is CTO and co-founder of Forethought Marketing. Tom will speak to the history of privacy compliance and introduce you to 4Comply terms and technology. Also joining Tom is Eric Vargas, Marketing Systems Manager at Forethought Marketing. Eric leads our software development team. He will introduce you to rights processing, a core module of 4Comply, and also provide a demo. Without further ado, let me turn the time over to our first presenter, Tom Sychek.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Richard. So as Richard said, I'm going to talk about a little background of compliance in the world today, primarily as it pertains to email marketing, electronic communications, and then talk about how 4Comply can help you touch on some of the key problems that we've seen in the area of compliance and how 4Comply can help you solve some of those problems. So first, just a quick history lesson. The first real legal entry into the world of compliance was the CAN-SPAM law introduced in the US back in 2003. And it was an opt-out regulation. It basically said to folks, if you don't want to receive emails from a company, you can opt out. It was largely unenforceable. There are some organizations that have sprung up to try to pinpoint people, highlight people who are abusing the CAN-SPAM law, but there has been very little enforcement of the law over the years. The next law that came into being was in Canada. The Canadian anti-spam law passed in 2010, became effective middle of 2014. And the big difference here is that we went from opt-out to opt-in. What CASL did is it introduced the notion of implied consent, which means that not only do you can you receive electronic communications when you give explicit consent, but you can also imply consent by, for instance, downloading a white paper, submitting a form, attending a webinar or an event. And what CASL did is it codified what some of those areas are in implied consent and introduced the notion of expiration dates or time to live. And basically it specified for implied consent that you could communicate with somebody under implied consent for 6 months. If there's a contractual arrangement, you could communicate for 2 years. And if somebody gave you explicit consent, then that was good until somebody removed that explicit consent. So that took compliance to a whole nother level beyond CAN-SPAM. Then in 2016, in the European Union, GDPR was passed. It became effective in the middle of 2018 and expanded upon the notion of opt-in, introduced the term legitimate interest, which gave companies more flexibility than CASL did, but required you to really be able to audit and specify the time to live or the expiration date. The other major piece that GDPR added in was the rights to access, right to portability, right to update your information, and the right to be forgotten. So these rights are available to individuals in the EU. Companies need to be able to respond to requests for these rights and importantly be able to audit the information that was sent out, audit the requests, and make sure that if some European citizen wants to know why you are interacting with them, that you can go to your audit trail and explain exactly what permissions you received from that individual. The most current law that was passed was in California, the California Consumer Protection Act, CCPA, which went into effect this year. Originally it was going to start on January 1st. It was delayed until the 1st of July, actually. The major difference in the CCPA is protection against selling personal data. Interestingly, it did not change the opt-out component of canned spam. It does not take California into the opt-in world. The primary change that CCPA introduced was, again, this protection against selling personal data. And then there are a number of other laws, either on the books or in draft, that are expanding around the world. There's also talk in the US Congress about a national law for the US as well. So this gives you a little bit of history as to where we started with the area of compliance. There's obviously a lot more details we're not going to go into in today's world, in today's webinar, but to give those of you who are chartered with implementing compliance a little bit of a history and where the laws are different around the world. So the next thing I want to talk about is some common terminology that we use when we talk about compliance. So I've mentioned opt-out and opt-in. So opt-out is basically telling a company, don't send me communications. So in the world of canned spam in the US and still in many parts of the world, you have the right to communicate with somebody until they explicitly opt out. In other parts, specifically within the EU under GDPR and under CASL in Canada, you cannot, as a company, you cannot communicate with somebody unless they opt in. So this introduced the notion of having forms on pages, on websites, where somebody explicitly opts in, or again, with the implied permission, gave you permission to send communications for a certain period of time. The next thing I want to talk about is the difference between consent and permission. So consent is something that is consciously, actively given by an individual to a company. So generally we think about it as consent to communicate. I'll talk about some other types of consent as well. But it is the action from the individual to the company. Permission is based on consent, but as I've mentioned, it's also could be based on implied agreement. So permission is what the company determines that they have to communicate with an individual. So somebody might give consent, and then that company has permission to communicate. Somebody might take an action, not give consent, but fill out a form, and there is implied agreement then, or implied permission to communicate with that individual. The other key element, key term that we want to make sure is understood is processing data. So under GDPR, GDPR does that not actually give you the right to communicate. What it does is it gives you the right to collect, store, or modify personal data, or what we call processing data. Implied, or what you can infer from processing data, is that you can communicate with an individual. If somebody has not given you consent to process data, you obviously can't communicate with them because you can't store their data from which you would communicate to them. So GDPR is a little bit different in the way that they structure the law, but the bottom line is that processing data basically is the way it's in practice, gives you the ability to communicate with an individual as well. So that's kind of high-level compliance. Let's talk about 4Comply, what we've got, and some of the issues that you will be able to handle with 4Comply. So first of all, 4Comply is a toolkit. It's a set of APIs and webhooks. It's an environment that allows you to integrate systems across your company that touch compliance. These systems might be your marketing automation tool, your CRM system, your e-commerce or support systems. So it basically is a framework in which you can take information from various systems and use that across the systems to handle your compliance concerns. We include with 4Comply a set of best practices that you can use as a template to start your system. This includes forms, emails, regulation setups, a number of items that we'll get into a little bit. But basically, we have a set of best practices for compliance setup. And then finally, a database, which includes all of the data that you need for compliance. So we have a table for consent, for permissions, for tracking rights requests, and finally an audit trail, so that if you do need to address this from a legal perspective, your audit, your information is all in one place from an auditing perspective. So what are the problems that we see, and why did we build 4Comply to begin with? So there are 4 common problems that we have run across as we've worked with people in the area of compliance. The first one is that there are multiple systems that receive consent from various sources. These could be form submissions, it could be event registrations, it could be trade show attendees, back in the days when we could attend trade shows. Rather than store compliance permissions or consent in each of these different systems, what we have found is that companies want to store this information in one central area so that it's all centralized and accessible from the various systems. Tied very closely to that is that different systems may need to know the status of those permissions. So your marketing automation tool may provide consent and may also need to know if they have permission to communicate, but your CRM system might also need to know if they have permission to communicate. You might get consent from your support system and again, be able to access that permission from another system in your ecosystem. So the idea here is that multiple systems might be providing consent, and multiple systems, some of the same, some different, may need to determine if there is permission to communicate. The third item is to be able to effectively, efficiently track and manage these rights requests. So we talked about the right to access, the right to update your information, the right to portability, and the right to be forgotten. We're actually going to, Eric, later in the webinar, Eric's going to actually walk you through the flow for right to portability. What do you need to do in order to pull all the data together and make that available to the individual who's asking for their data? And then the last item, which I touched on, is a single system of record for auditing purposes. Most of the laws now allow individuals to potentially sue a company if they have abused their ability to communicate. So you want to be able to easily and quickly get all of the information that tells your legal department why it is you feel you have the right to communicate. So when somebody provides consent, when somebody does some action that implies permission, implies consent, all that information is stored in one common legal vault so that you can easily get an audit trail when you need to respond to questions from your contacts. Within 4Comply, we have 4 key modules to help you with this. So the first is the consent and permissions module. This stores the consent and permissions for each regulation. We actually allow you to configure the regulations. I'll touch on that a little bit later. You can receive the data from various systems and respond to requests from various systems as well. The rights request and flows module. So again, you can configure and manage all of your flows for the different rights requests. And this stores a log of all the requests, again, for auditing purposes. So that if somebody has asked for the right to update, you can see exactly where they are in the process and if they've completed their request. The third item is the legal activities vault, which again stores all of the activities that might be required for an audit to respond to an individual who's asking, why are you communicating with me? And then finally, we have a couple different sets of reporting tools that are very user-friendly, both from a development perspective, so the developer can go in and get obviously the log information, the activity information, but from a business perspective, allows the marketing individuals or the legal individuals to get easily accessible and in visual format where things lie in terms of the number of people who have given consent, when consent will expire, if there's anybody who's out of compliance, things of that nature. What makes these up is a centralized database. So the database, as I've mentioned, has both consent permission table, the rights request table, and the legal activities vault. We have API calls and webhooks to allow you to send data into 4Comply and receive information back, so that a marketing automation tool, a CRM tool, can easily request to see if there's permission to communicate and receive that information back as part of their communication flow. The rights requests and flows, again, the ability to notify systems of outstanding requests. So you might have information in 3 or 4 different systems. When somebody says, I want to access my data, you might have to go to 3 or 4 different systems to get that information. And so 4Comply has the tools that allow you to reach out to those various systems and then know when you've received all the information back and respond back to the user. And then finally, we have some out-of-the-box forms and emails that you can use as is or use as templates to configure to meet your needs as well. And then finally, along with all of the out-of-the-box items, everything's completely configurable. So we have, out of the box, we have set up the requirements for the current regulations for GDPR, for CASL, for CCPA. As new laws are finalized, we will put those regulations in as well, but it will allow you to configure to meet your needs. One of the key elements is the time to live, or the expiration date. So as you get into configuring it, you can change according to your needs. The rights request flows are also there, so that we have out-of-the-box flows, or again, you can customize them to meet your needs. I mentioned time to live, so we definitely would recommend get into this, that you meet with your legal teams to adapt to the requirements of your particular needs in your particular company. And then finally, it's a toolkit. You can build it yourself, or we can help you out. We're not legal experts, but we have implemented countless compliance systems. We can help you build yours, or we can be there to assist you as you get into it yourself. So either way, we're here to help. So that gives you a little bit of an overview about what 4Comply is, why we built it, how you might be able to use it. I'm going to turn it over to Eric now, who's actually going to walk you through a little bit under the covers as a developer, what you might encounter when you go into 4Comply. So Eric, it's all yours.
All right, thank you very much, Tom. Good morning. So as Tom described, basically 4Comply does give you a lot of abilities to handle compliance with the right request. So we're going to talk about a particular scenario and how really 4Comply can help you be compliant or commit the right request processing across all of your organization. So if we go to the next slide, the major benefit is that we can, 4Comply will handle the process throughout all of your systems. So if you have a CRM, you have a marketing automation system, right now the process, or with 4Comply, you will be able to have all of the parties in line, making sure that the right request is obtaining data from all of the multiple sources, instead of, again, having to manually send emails to different admins or handle the process manually. Basically, 4Comply is going to communicate with your systems using webhooks and API calls. So developers or different parties in your organization can subscribe and trigger events in 4Comply based on webhooks. So they can be notified whenever someone has submitted a request for, again, right to portability or right to access or any of the rights, GDPR rights, and be able to react to that. And 4Comply will then consolidate all the information across all of the systems and handle the process. So basically, with out of the box, we have the solution to again, comply with the flows up to the point where a user can, or we provide forms where the user can request a right. The logic within 4Comply can be customized to identify which is the regulation that applies to a given digital citizen. We'll then handle the identity validation to make sure that whoever is requesting the right is the person that claims to be. So there's an email validation process out of the box to, again, confirm that's the right person. And internally, there's a workflow that will lay out which are the steps or which are the processes that need to occur in order to comply with the law, and making sure that if the record has to be updated across your organization, across all systems, that all systems are receive that information. They all confirm that the record has been updated. Same case with the right to be forgotten, making sure that the request for a digital citizen to be deleted in your systems, or it's properly taken care of. And you have an audit trail also to make sure that everyone in your organization has been compliant with that request. Finally, 4Comply does have the ability to communicate to the user. And again, in some of the rights, there will be an email with the link to the actual data that they requested, and the right to access. A digital citizen can request to see what's all the information that we have about them. So that's going to be sent out in the email. And again, everything in this process can be customized. So an example of a flow that's coming in out of the box in 4Comply is the one that we have here. Basically, this is for the right to portability. So the flow outlines what happens whenever, again, someone has requested a right. There's the ability to customize this flow in case, I'm not sure if you want to have an additional validation or some other process as well. But from the first step, where the user can submit a form to request to exercise a right, the workflow outlines what needs to happen. In this case, send an email to the user, making sure that when they confirm, then the processing will continue, or the person will be paused until they confirm their identity. And then 4Comply will send webhooks to all the different systems in your organization to make sure that they can find information about this person, send that information back to 4Comply, and finally notify the end user about the results. So yeah, basically there's a flow for each of the rights that are requested in the law, and you have the ability to customize or again, disable some of the pieces. Additionally, you can also have, instead of having the forms that you have built into 4Comply, you can integrate your existing forms. So if you have a form already in your website, or you have a form in Eloqua or any other marketing automation tool, you could use that to trigger the process within 4Comply. It doesn't have to be on the 4Comply forms. Basically, what it takes is a repost. Just have the external form post the data to 4Comply to a particular endpoint. The required fields will be just the email address of the person, the request type, again, if it's the right to access, right to update, right to be forgotten, or right to portability. And important also is to specify the geolocation of the person, because that obviously defines what's the regulation to be applied. So either if it's based on country or state, if it's a person in the EU, or in Canada, every regulation will change. So there's also the scenario where compliance laws are different based on the state, like is happening with the TCPA. So it's also important to, again, there's an optional parameter there to specify if it needs to comply to a law per state. Okay. So this is an example of submit a post from an external form. So it's, again, pretty straightforward. Basically, we're sending data or we're sending a post request to the 4Comply right request endpoint. sending, in this case, the email and the request type. Again, 4Comply also has the ability to detect the geo based on the IP address of the requester. So, and it also can be sent in the header, or can be sent as part of the request. Basically, this will trigger the process in 4Comply and making sure that that workflow that we discussed before, it's gonna be, it's gonna get started with the information that we get from this form. Okay. So then what happens when 4Comply receives that information? Basically, you have in the configuration, you can specify which systems you are gonna have connected and specify webhooks that will, again, get triggered on particular scenarios or in specific events. So a system can be subscribed, you can have a single webhook to receive all the requests from 4Comply. You can have multiple webhooks per system. And basically you're just, your systems will be subscribed to receive notifications whenever there's a new request. And they will be also required to provide a status and communicate what the completion of the process in the workflow. So, for example, there are some rights that even require an additional step, like the right to update and right to be forgotten, where there's an action to happen in the system, either update the information about the record or delete the existing records, delete the information that someone has about them. So 4Comply, it's gonna then trigger additional actions to make sure that that happens, and also keep track of the responses and the confirmation from the systems that the process has been completed. There are also abilities, like in this case, to have buckets to capture the data that has been sent for RT, for right to portability or right to update, or even for right to be forgotten, to again keep an archive of the data, or again, if whatever response that we receive from the systems after completion, that can be also stored in 4Comply. And also there are specific endpoints and API calls that can allow systems to indicate what's the status of a particular request. So whenever a system receives a call through a webhook to, let's say, accommodate for RTA, the right to access the information. So once the system A obtains the information about the contact and pushes up to the to 4Comply, the system needs to make a call to indicate 4Comply that that process has been completed, that the status has been fulfilled on their side. So that, again, in this case, 4Comply can keep track of all the responses, and also for auditing purposes, making sure we get the responses from all of the systems, and we're good to go, then communicate to the customer. Okay, so now getting a bit more technical, basically you can sign up or register for register webhooks in 4Comply by just doing a regular post to the 4Comply API endpoints. There's obviously authentication that's not covered here, but you're pretty much subscribing to a webhook URL, and you're just sending the URL where you want the data to be received and to what kind of events or actions you want to be subscribed. So if there are some systems that will only need to be notified in case of RTA, or in case of particular rights, then again, you can have custom webhooks registered for those. If you want to have, again, a webhook for every system and for every action, 4Comply can also accommodate for that scenario. And internally in your system, you can handle the request. You're getting for each of the rights, you're getting the information about the email address about the person that has requested the right. So in this particular example for RTP, we are going to receive the email of the person and the ID of the request, and pretty much get the information from our system, capture that in, again, whatever format, hopefully JSON or a similar format, that can be pushed up to 4Comply through a put request. indicating the request ID and again, whatever state the process is. And your system can then indicate, again, or send the information of the 4Comply and change the status to make sure what's the next step. And finally, if you, and this is the last process or is the last system that we know needs to send data for a process to be completed, then we can send again the formula complete status to make sure that the flow can now go into the next step and communicate to the end user. Again, send the data or the status of the request that they started. Okay. So as a brief summary of the this section, we basically have covered that 4Comply can or provides the workflows for the different rights that are specified in the compliance regulations, and it can handle all the process from the form submit, whatever the user is requesting the right to be executed or is requesting his right to exercise the right, to the point of communicating with multiple systems, again, also validating the identity of the person, communicating with multiple systems, tracking their responses, tracking the data and the actions that happen on each system, and finally communicate to the user when everything has been completed and the results of the process. So basically, the way the 4Comply is communicating with those systems is through webhooks and API calls, as we have discussed. And this whole process, again, as it's coming out of the box, pretty much ready to use. But if you need to customize anything in it, from the point of customizing the forms, the email layouts, the workflows, if you want to have, let's say, additional approvals in the middle, or again, for some reason change the process, the standard flow, you can do so, and 4Comply does have that flexibility to make it your own, right? And customize your interpretation of the right processing. So now we're gonna do a quick demo, and about to share my screen. Should be able to see it now. So this is the main screen of 4Comply. Right now, this is actually showing the distribution of consent across the globe. But now we're going to focus into write requests. So here on the left side, under rights flows, we can see again the flows that are set up or that are coming in out of the box for the regulations, and in this case, RTP. This is the screenshot that we saw also in the presentation. So for this flow, you can enable or disable any step along the way, and will be bypassed. The standard flow in this area that we're going to cover comes from, again, the form that where the user can request the right to portability. There's an email going out to the user for confirmation. Once the user confirms that or clicks on the link in the email, then there is a call to a webhook that will notify, again, whatever systems are subscribed, that this person has requested the right. 4Comply will then be waiting on the fulfillment, making sure that all of the systems respond, and the systems will be sending the data for RTP, in this case, the information they want to send about the person, again, in a portable format. Once the data collection process is complete, there will be an email going out to the user with a link to, again, a file that will contain all the information from the multiple systems. Finally, there's a decision here to making sure that if the process was successful or it was a failure. And this is also important for, obviously, for tracking and auditing purposes. Out of the box, we have forms for each of the rights, and again, they can be customized and they can be changed however you want. In this particular case, I'm gonna fill out a form with my email address and the country of France, And actually, I'm not going to hit there just yet. As an example of the system integrations, in this case, we have Eloqua, and we have a particular app or a couple of apps that we created to accommodate or to fulfill the process. So in this example, we have what's called in Eloqua a cloud feeder, which is basically a way to feed records into the Eloqua workflow. And under the configuration, we can see we're presented with a webhook URL. This webhook URL is one that you can subscribe or you can configure under webhooks here in 4Comply and set it up to be to receive information again whenever someone has completed the RTP process. In this case, once they confirm their email, there will be a call from 4Comply to this webhook, which is again the one that's presented in the Eloqua program. So that means that once we fill out the form, okay, so in 4Comply, we will be able to see the write request as it just came in. We can see the record and in which area of the process it is. So right now it's again, obviously waiting for the email to be confirmed. So I'm just gonna navigate into my inbox and maybe wait a couple, maybe wait a few seconds for the email to come in. And whenever I respond, or by the time that you get the email and confirm the identity, the record will be fed into the Eloqua canvas. And also we have this other app in Eloqua that specifically for right to portability has the ability to specify which fields need to be sent over to 4Comply, and it will need to be or will be sent to the user once again, just so that they can see or they can fulfill the right according to the law. Okay, so just gonna have to wait a couple more seconds for the record to come in. But yeah, I mean, basically the process, let me just go back to the flows. In the fulfillment process, basically, we're gonna have a user can see where in the step or where in the overall processing the record is. Once the systems are responding and they're again sending data back to 4Comply, anyone that's auditing the system can go in and see the request and see which files are have been sent from the multiple systems. Okay, so maybe I fill out the form. Let me try that again. So there's a chance I may have put in the wrong email address. Okay, so let me open up with friends. Okay. And let me go back to my inbox. Okay, I hear it now. Yeah, probably user error there. This is the email that I got from 4Comply. Here I can validate my identity. And then if we go to 4Comply and look at the request, we can see that the record has now moved from the email confirm, and right now it's waiting for the systems to send the data. The process actually is pretty fast. So the record already went through the feeder and went through the app, send the information to 4Comply. We can see the record here in the step, and already compiled the information and sent me an email with the results. So here's the final email. Thank you for verifying your identity. Click here to access your portable file. So then the user is presented with a file according to the specifics of the law. It has to be a file in a computer readable format. So they are presented with a JSON file that again will have all the fields that have been specified in the app, or again for each of the systems. And yeah, they can see that file is actually loading right now, so I'll be able to show it to you in a couple seconds. But yeah, basically, as we saw, 4Comply received the request from the user, communicated with the systems. Now, again, the user was able to just receive easily the confirmation of the request, validate their identity, and they were presented with an email with the results. So yeah, that basically covers how the write request processing happens. And here's the file finally open on my side. So with the information about my profile in the Eloqua system, and again, if we have multiple systems integrated, we will have multiple files that are presented to the user with the information about the fields that they requested. All right, so I think that this summarizes the demo. Now we're going back to Richard.
All right, thank you very much. We'll move into the question and answer portion of our presentation today. As a reminder, if you have questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. I'm going to take a look at the questions and we'll get started. All right, so our first question is for Tom. Tom, how do you handle a situation with conflicting regulations?
We get this question often, actually. People are concerned that somebody might be under different regulations. And our best practice for this, and the way 4Comply is set up, is that an individual is really only under the auspices of one regulation. One of the things that we didn't touch on, but we have the ability for 4Comply to ascertain between systems which system with a country of record for, usually it's from your ERP system, but generally every company has a system of record, and we use that system to determine the country that that individual lives in. And then we say that, okay, regardless of the information that comes in from other systems, the system of record is going to determine the regulation that covers that individual.
Great, thank you. Our next question is also for you, Tom. It says, will 4Comply work with ASA, the regulations for Australia and New Zealand?
Absolutely. As I mentioned in during my presentation, the regulations are completely configurable, and as new regulations get completed and brought into law, we will put those into the default configuration as well. But if you're ahead of us and want to put in a regulation on your own, part of the user documentation allows you to set up the regulation configuration, which includes, the time to live, the processing purposes. There's about 4 or 5 key elements that you need to add for each regulation that you add into the system. And again, as I mentioned, even using the out-of-the-box configuration, if your legal department has a different view of the world, which I'll be honest, almost everyone does, you can certainly easily modify the defaults that we send you.
Great, thank you. Our next question is for you, Eric. You showed a request to portability for one system. How would you do it for 2 systems?
Sure. So in 4Comply, you can register multiple webhooks. So in our particular demo, we only had a webhook for Eloqua, but if you had, again, CRM, ERP, and marketing automation tool, 4Comply will send the webhook call, or will send a request for the write to all of the different systems, and we'll be expecting a response for each one. And it will be replying to the customer once all of the systems have responded properly. So yeah, it's in our particular demo, we only had one system configured, but 4Comply is set up to have as many as you need.
Great, thank you. Our next question is for you, Tom. How does 4Comply determine time to live?
Oh boy, that's a 3-hour discussion. Just recap, time to live is the time by which you state that you can communicate with somebody under legitimate interest or implied consent. If it's a Canadian contact, it's by law. Implied consent under CASL is 6 months. And that would be the time to live, and that's how the system is configured. For GDPR or for other laws that have legitimate interest or things like legitimate interest, we generally, if we're brought in, we help people walk through this, but basically for each type of implied legitimate interest and implied consent that you receive, you can set up a different time to live. So for example, if somebody downloads a white paper, you might, in concert with your marketing team and your legal team, say that you have legitimate interest to communicate with them for 6 months. And so part of your configuration would be for a form submit with download, it would be 6 months. You might say, if somebody attends a webinar, like folks have attended a webinar today, you might say, you know what, a webinar is not as strong an indication, and so we might say it's only 3 months. And so we would set up a time to live for attending a webinar being 3 months. Or you might switch those and say, attending a webinar shows a lot of interest, and you might say that's actually 9 months. So for each type of activity that you use to bring data into 4Comply or into your systems, you can set a different time to live for each of those different activities. So it's a process you would go through with the marketing team, usually, and with the legal team to make that determination, figure out which different activities are going to be tracked, and set up a time to live for each one of those. And then once you configure that inside of 4Comply, 4Comply uses that to set the expiration date for permissions going forward.
Great, thank you. Again, Tom, another question for you. We've already implemented GDPR in Salesforce. How does 4Comply help with this?
So one of the things that 4Comply is really strong at is this cross-system integration. So what we have found with many of our customers is that they have implemented compliance in one system, like Salesforce, or might be Marketo or Eloqua on the marketing side of things. And then they discover that the other primary systems in the company have different view of what consent or permission is. So your Salesforce tool might have given consent for certain activities or certain actions, and then you find out that your marketing automation tool is using a completely different set of permissions or consent. And so what we would suggest, and what we would do if you asked us to come in and help you, is reconcile those differences and use 4Comply to be that central system of record, so that you don't have the situation where different systems have different versions of permission. With one system, you can usually do it inside that system. With two systems, it gets a little bit more complex. And then every time you add another system into the mix, the complexity grows pretty much exponentially to the point where you really need a central database, and that's really where 4Comply comes into play.
Great. It looks like we have one more question, and again, it's for you, Tom. Do you have connections to other apps besides Eloqua?
At this point in time, we do not. We are constantly looking for different systems that would require a connection to 4Comply. As I think everybody knows, we just recently released the product, and so we took Eloqua as our primary tool to implement along with the implementation. But other systems like Salesforce or Marketo or Pardot, primarily in the CRM and marketing automation areas, are the ones that we will address first, and then expand out from there. So we'll always be looking for other connections to make. If you have anything particular that you need some help with, let us know, and we'll be making announcements in the future as we add more connections.
Great. Looks like we've covered all our questions. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Eric, for your presentation and for the questions and answers. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. As a reminder, tomorrow you'll receive an email with a link to today's recording. If you would like to speak to someone about the products and services mentioned today, please send your questions to info@forethoughtmarketing.com. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Good day.